Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Inka Vat. Today we're discussing the Pacific Islands, a group of thousands of islands, including Hawaii, which lie west of Taiwan, the Philippines and Australia, and why they have become one of the hottest geostrategic spots in the region. With a new U.S. Papua New Guinea defense pact to counterbalance China's with the Solomon Islands, as well as deepening expansion by the U.S. Coast Guard and Chinese goodwill missions in the region. With me to discuss this are Tang Shao-cheng, National Chengchi University Institute of International Relations Professor, Peifen Hsieh, Democratic Progressive Party Spokesperson and Department of International Affairs Director, and Howard Shen, Kuomintang Youth League Deputy Leader. Professor Tang, Peifen, Howard, very warm welcome to the show today. But first, I speak to Cleo Paskal, a non-resident senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies, widely regarded as one of the leading experts on the Pacific Island nations. I began by asking her what China is doing in the region.
So the concern is that if China is serious about taking Taiwan, it needs to at least contain, if not control, the Pacific Islands. Guam, they have a so-called Guam killer missile that's in the Chinese media that they talk about. There's been active political warfare campaigns in the freely associated states, those three countries, Palau, Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia. They almost, two Chinese probably agents tried to bring down the government of the Marshall Islands when they couldn't get their way, when they tried to set up a country within a country, which would have deeply affected their relationship with Taiwan, but also with the U.S. So they're creating this kind of instability across the region, which leaves them much more open to Chinese influence, and it also weakens the U.S.'s ability potentially to deploy.
So tell me more about the U.S. deployment and why this is geographically important.
You have that first island chain, and then you have the second island chain behind it, which goes down from Japan and then through the Marianas and Guam. And the whole U.S. defense strategy is very much focused on that edge of the Pacific map, where they've got the bases in Japan, the bases in South Korea, the treaty allies in the Philippines, in Australia, and the idea is that's the defensive wall. What underpins that idea is you can get from Hawaii to the wall, but the way to get from Hawaii to the wall is through those freely associated states. The agreements those three countries have with the U.S. completely unique. They've given over their defense and security rights to the United States. The U.S. can set up bases. They can deny any other country from operating militarily in those waters. So it becomes an extension of the U.S. defense perimeter, and it creates a kind of corridor of deployment, but also of freedom from Hawaii all the way through to the Guam and Marianas, which connects them to Philippines and Japan. So without that middle part of the Pacific, you don't have that freedom of movement from Hawaii to the second island and first island chain.
Cleo Paskal from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies outlined there in any potential Chinese attack on Taiwan with a committed U.S. military that the U.S. would need to get from its military stronghold in Hawaii to the first and second island chains, which she calls the wall. Now, given the objective outlined here, Howard, what do you think is the most significant U.S. development in the Pacific Island region?
Right. Thank you for having me. I think the most crucial development by the U.S. in the region is the American attempt to renew codify agreements with the three free association states, Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and the Republic of Palau.
Okay.
It has given the United States such privileged defense and economic presence in such a crucial region. In the midst of the strategic competition between the United States and People's Republic of China, it gives the United States a privileged defense position to strategically deny other military presence within the surrounded region.
Right, great. Professor Tang there, so do you agree the bilateral treaties with the three countries, Micronesia, Palau and Marshall Islands, anything else that really sticks out for you?
China tries to extend its influence as strong and as much as possible It is clear because they have their intentions, they have their ambitions, not only on Taiwan, but also against vis-a-vis the United States.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you say
Well,
this is
that's
not just
why
about the Taiwan contingency. It's actually
it's
about
not only on Taiwan.
Okay. So the
Yeah,
U.S.-China rivalry as well.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, and and China tries to extend, as I said, the influence. That's why the Americans, the United States, they try to contain the Chinese influence and Chinese extension. And that's why. So they have their games in this region. This is very clear. It's just like in South China, South Asia and South China Sea, and also in the Middle East. I mean, these are all the same, and they compete without any question. So that's why that the United States, because they neglect this area for some time since the Second World War, but since the last few years, the Americans they observe, they have seen that in this part of the world is actually a weak point for the United States. So they have to strengthen their might and their influence in this region to contain China.
Absolutely. Okay. So Peifen, do you sense that there is an urgency on the part of the U.S., perhaps because of a possible Taiwan contingency, or do you agree with the professor that maybe this is just about that great power rivalry?
I would say both. I think one of the crucial developments in the United States in this region is the institutionalization of several U.S. Pacific relations. For example, the first one being the AUKUS, which is the alliance among the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, and the second one being the first ever U.S. Pacific Island Summit in September last year, and also with the visit of Vice President Harris to the region. And the third one is in this year, in February, the United States reopened its embassy in Fiji, in Solomon Islands, after 30 years. I think all this kind of further institutionalization of the relations between the United States and the Pacific really shows that the U.S. is putting greater emphasis on this region.
Yeah. So Howard, would you like to comment about that? Peifen mentioned, you know, the importance of being there, having the diplomatic office, having the one in, I think, also Solomon Islands, but also Tonga and Kiribati is also promised, right? How about the military side of things? Is that something that you thought was important in terms of the defense cooperation agreement with Papua New Guinea?
Well, the American military presence in the region can help combat what we call IUU, the illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishings in the region, because that is one of the two most important issues that our partners and allies in the region care about.
The other being climate change. Climate
change, of course. So I agree with both Professor and Peifen that their presence in the Pacific Islands is a part of the grander U.S. PRC strategic competition, but also in response to a potential Taiwan Strait conflict, because there is a very clear compartmentalization of U.S. strategy, as in they want Pacific initiatives, or just any initiative from U.S. allies at all, to be something that is of bottom-up nature, meaning that if that is something that will be applied to the Pacific Island states, the Pacific Island states will have to come up with them themselves, so that the United States can meet their Pacific allies and partners where they are.
And so this theme that you talk about is very important for the Pacific Islands. They want to be treated as equals, as you said, partners, as agents, not being talked down to. Can we, and you also raise, of course, the priorities of the Pacific Islands themselves. Professor, would it be true to say that, you know, this is a relationship where there needs to be give and take? So whilst there are priorities on the Pacific Islands side in terms of climate change, in terms of the illegal activity, illegal fishing and
unregulated, unreported IUU,
and drug trafficking, you know, the United States does want to have that defense cooperation. They want to have the access to the for example, Papua New Guinea bases. They want to get them before the Chinese, for example, gets them.
I would say the United States, they play the high politics, and the Chinese, they play the low politics. That means the Chinese, they offer, for instance, economic supports and so on to these countries.
So, but sometimes through high debt.
Yeah, this is another question.
That's another issue,
this is another question. So they have to wait out which one is much more beneficial for them. So sometimes they think, for the people or for the improving of the living is much more important than the defense budget and defense policies. So they have to wait out which one they want to choose. But sometimes they can balance between the two big powers, China and the United States. So that's their policy, and they have to use their talent, their wisdom to make the best choice for themselves.
I see. So you're saying that they're actually in an enviable position where, in a sense, they're being courted by both sides, by both the U.S.
That's right.
and China.
And China.
Okay.
Yeah.
Peifen, let's talk about also the biennial Talisman Sabre exercise. Now, this is the largest in history. 13 nations, I believe, 30,000 participants, and also this time 3 Pacific Island nations. What did you make, of this? Was this about preparing, I guess, militarily, about the interoperability? How much of it was about messaging?
I believe it's also both. It's first that if you cooperate during peacetime, then you can cooperate during the crisis. Well, and vice versa. If you do not have this cooperative relations during peacetime, then it's really hard when conflict comes that you can work with each other. But the second is about messaging. It's about a message to the PRC that we are all working together. And if you, so it's really, I think, also showing, sending a message to this region that the United States is still here. It has a strong and even a stronger presence than before here. So when the PRC wants to intervene even more deeper in this region, you have to think twice. I think it's about both, and I think this will not be an exception. It will only be a beginning of a further and more intense cooperation among all these countries.
Howard, I just want to pick up on something that Professor said. He talked about the kind of years of neglect by the United States of the region after the Cold War. So in a sense, China has had decades of a head start, if you want to put it that way, in terms of building the relationships, and as a professor said, sort of by providing, the economic development of things. So, how hard will it be for Washington to convince these countries, that this, isn't going to be like a previous burst of interest that will disappear very quickly?
Well, I think on the American Capitol Hill, there is a once in 2 decades chance for the American Congress to renew the COFA agreement. So when the COFA agreements with the 3 countries are actually renewed, the American presence will be guaranteed for once again, for another 20 years. Of course, there was a shift in resource distribution after the Cold War because of the turmoils elsewhere in the Balkans, in the Middle East. But seeing that the People's Republic of China is not going anywhere else, I think the Pacific Island nations can rest assured that the United States will be there for as long as possible.
Okay. Now, let's hear again from Cleo Paskal at Foundation for Defense of Democracies about the letter written by David Panuelo, former president of the Federated States of Micronesia, which recognizes China rather than Taiwan. As mentioned earlier, Micronesia is the center of the 3 Pacific Island nations known as the Freely Associated States, with Palau to the west and Marshall Islands to the east. Let's take a look. Can you talk about, David Panuelo's letter in March, and the offer that was made?
I'm very glad you asked. So the country in the middle is called the Federated States of Micronesia, and it's there are three: Palau, Micronesia, Marshall Islands. The two outer ones recognize Taiwan. The middle one recognizes China. And the president of that country, David Panuelo, wrote a letter, an internal letter for the leaders in his country saying, while I've been president, this is the sort of stuff that China has been doing. And he described very aggressive political warfare, the buying off of members of his cabinet, the funding of secessionist movement, independence movements. There was one international meeting he didn't want to attend. He didn't want his country to attend, and China selected a citizen of his country to represent his country at the meeting, completely outside.
A Chinese citizen?
No, he was just a local Micronesian, and the Chinese government said, this person is going to represent your whole country. He had no role in government. He wasn't being sent from Micronesia. The Chinese just bypassed completely normal protocol. And what David Panuelo then said was, and this is why we would prefer to recognize Taiwan. That was March 9th. He detailed discussions he had with Joseph Wu, where he said, this is what we would need, because as soon as we say that, China's going to pull all its money out. They're going to try to crash our economy like they tried to do with Palau. And so this is what we need. And then silence.
From the Taiwan side?
I'm not sure what happened with the Taiwan side, but there was silence from the American side. And Taiwan can't move without the U.S. Taiwan couldn't have done it without State Department approval. And from what I heard, that wasn't forthcoming.
So what happened? Why?
I have no idea. You'd have to ask the State Department. If both Palau and Marshall Islands, two countries which recognize Taiwan, both have elections coming up. China is funding political campaigns in both those countries to de-recognize Taiwan. If they de-recognize Taiwan, Chinese embassies go in, and those Chinese embassies act like spy and influence bases. And so that again undermines the U.S. ability potentially to position itself militarily across the region. So this undervaluing of the importance of the recognition of Taiwan is a real danger, I think, to a free and open Indo-Pacific generally and U.S. security specifically.
Peifen, we heard there some of the, buying members of Panuelo's cabinet, funding independence movements, choosing an ordinary Micronesian simply to represent the entire country because Panuelo didn't want the country to be part of this. What do you make of these tactics, this strategy?
Well, I think it's very commonly seen in the many countries that are greatly influenced by China. So the corruption and the buying of certain officials, despite the overall benefits of the whole country. And that's why some of the Pacific countries, such as Micronesia, were talking about switching ties from PRC to ROC Taiwan. But I think Solomon Islands is one very significant example.
Yeah,
so,
tell us about what's happened there since it switched allegiances.
So Solomon Islands switches recognition from PRC from ROC to PRC in 2019, and right after it's a switch, then One Belt, One Road came in the initiative, and at first it's very like some other countries that OBOR has come in, that the Solomon Islands were promised a lot of developments and loans. But then in 2022, there was a security agreement between China and Solomon Islands. And I think that's the real intention of China wanting the Solomon Islands to be part of its influence, sphere of influence. And that security agreement was hugely criticized by other politicians in the Solomon Islands as well, because it went without the parliamentary oversight. And I think that's one example why the Chinese influence and intervention in such countries sometimes become very problematic, because it causes a lot of non-transparency and rooms for corruption. And that's one example. And I think other Pacific Islands, they are actually all working very closely, because I worked with the Tuvalu's permanent mission to the United Nations before. So I I know they work very closely, and their exchange of intelligence is like very frequent.
Peifen, so also in the Solomon Islands, the buying up at the press, corrupting the judiciary, also taking control of the police, but there's also the fact that they delayed their elections. Can you tell us why this is significant?
Well, that's a destroyment of the Solomon Islands democracy. That's very obvious. And I think that's one thing that comes with the Chinese aids and loans and all the investments in the country. So once they gain the influence and substantial influence in the country, then they also export the Chinese political model to the country. And although the Pacific Islands in general have like laser influence in the world democracies. They are the young democracies, and such interventions such as delay election is really a huge scandal in terms of democratic countries. So I think this is really problematic, and other Pacific countries are also looking at the example of Solomon Islands, and they would tell themselves, do you want that? Do we want to go back to those times when we didn't really have a democracies of full-grown democracies? And that's price is that maybe you have investments from China to the country, but then you are paying the price of democracy.
Howard, Peifen also mentioned, of course, the security agreement between the Solomon Islands and China, but before that, there was the groundbreaking trip by Wang Yi, where he tried to meet the Pacific Island Forum and to sign, the security agreement with almost like a multilateral agreement.
The desired dominance by the Chinese Communist Party, the People's Republic of China, has been quite apparent, very frankly. They tried to do the same thing with ASEAN countries, and now they're trying to assert more and more influence amongst the Pacific Island nations. But of course, not just the Chinese Communist Party members are doing that. We see American Secretary of State Antony Blinken, we see American Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin III trying to do the same outreach to their Pacific partners and allies in the very crucial region that they are focusing on. So,
but would you agree, though, that in the U.S. sense, it's not offensive? It isn't for offensive purposes. I'm talking about a security agreement or a defense agreement. Whereas with China, it would be for a Taiwan contingency, for South China Sea.
When President Marcos of the Philippines decided to reinvigorate the enhanced defense cooperation arrangement, he made promise to Beijing that it is not for offensive use. And 3 months before that, he was just in Beijing securing over 22 billion of investment in Philippine agribusiness. So I think countries, especially smaller countries, well, smaller as in smaller than the United States and the People's Republic of China, smaller countries in between the United States and Beijing, they hedge by nature. If they can improve their citizens' lives by doing so, by doing multiple outreach, or in this sense, in the sense of U.S. PRC strategic competition, by doing 2 outreach at the same time, they will do that. And I think the current U.S. administration recognizes the Pacific outreach to all the partners they can get, and they welcome that.
Professor Tang, so finally, in terms of this, or let's call it China's battle for influence, and if we go back to what Cleo said, that they, in a Taiwan contingency, they would need to either control or contain the Pacific Islands. How successful is it?
I would say in the rivalry with the United States, 50-50. China has gained ground in some ways, and also the United States. So they compete in this area. It's very obvious. But whether, which one will win at a day at last. This is still a puzzle. It's still
up for grabs.
It's still not clear.
Okay.
So we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, Peifen, very last, one sentence each. What's your view? Who is going to be winning in this battle for influence?
I think it's still the United States because it traditionally has a great presence in this region, and China is a latecomer. So even though the United States has been in the past decades or so has been switching its attention and focus to other regions, it still has that traditional influence here.
Howard,
Right.
do you think that they're showing that they're serious, the Americans, serious about coming back to the region, supporting and treating the Pacific Island nations as their equals?
I do agree with Peifen that the People's Republic of China, they're latecomers, so the United States has a presupposed advantage in the region. But of course, if the United States decided to fall down the previous path in neglecting the hearts and minds in the Pacific Island nations, it is quite easy, very frankly, that the People's Republic of China can gain a major foothold in the region. So I think the most important thing is to focus on hearts and minds in the region, in the country, and do the good local outreach that the United States always do.
Okay, so they've got one last chance and they mustn't botch it up. Okay, Professor Tang, Peifen, and Howard, thank you so much for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe and see you next time.